Game development is hard. Very hard. Anyone who works in game development, whether it be in an indie company or in a big studio, will tell you so. And sometimes everything that can go wrong does go wrong. Projects get put on hold, developers get laid off, and companies dissolve. Due to problems in management and various other aspects, some games never get to see the light of day. In fact, there are a whole slew of cancelled video games we will probably never know about, and the few we are aware of will likely forever be lost media. Cancelled video games always fascinated me for this reason. It's this mysterious part of video game culture that we were never meant to see. It's thousands of working hours put into video games we were never going to play. And while this is incredibly unfortunate, occasionally we do get to catch some glimpses of those cancelled games. And so for this video, I decided to take a look at 5 racing games that got cancelled for one reason or another. These range from big budget titles to revivals of old franchises and even new IPs we were never meant to experience. In fact, let's start right there and talk about a cancelled racing game all about Lamborghini. It's the early 2000s and the original Xbox is trying to get a foot in the door of the console market. With its direct competitor, the PS2, boasting a vast library of critically acclaimed racing games, the Xbox was in desperate need of new racing titles. In comes Rage Games, an at the time seasoned sports and racing game studio from the UK. Initially, they garnered their first experiences with making racing games in the mid-90s, with games like Power Drive, a top-down racer for the Super Nintendo, and other adjacent systems at the time. Once the 6th console generation was on its way, Rage Games worked on their first fully 3D racing game, titled Wild Wild Racing for the PlayStation 2, which proved to be a rough transition for the team as the game was only met with mixed reviews. Despite the reception, they continued to work on more racing games, though this time primarily for the PC. My favorite one out of these must be Off-Road Redneck Racing, purely for the name itself and this goofy cover. I mean, look, it's got the Leonard and Bubba seal of approval. Who are these people? In the end, this culminated into a return to the console market, this time with a branded racing game. This was a fairly popular practice in the 2000s, to make a racing game in collaboration with just one car manufacturer. Back then you had series such as Ford Racing or titles like Need for Speed Porsche Unleashed, and Rage Games was working on putting their own mark in this fairly niche part of the racing game genre. In collaboration with none other than Lamborghini, the game would aptly be named Lamborghini. Yeah, that's not a joke. It was literally just supposed to be called Lamborghini. And in March 2003, a playable demo was made available through the official Xbox magazine in Europe. But sadly, the full game was never going to see the light of day, as later that same year, the development on the game would come to an abrupt end as the studio behind it would shut its doors. Due to ongoing financial issues to stay afloat, Rage Games went bankrupt while working on Lamborghini, and the full game would be lost in limbo as nobody could be found to buy up the studio and by extension the game. But unexpectedly, almost 2 decades later in the year 2022, an unreleased beta build of the game was uploaded to the internet for anyone to download and try out. This sort of thing is pretty unprecedented, as the game itself fell mostly into obscurity in the coming years of its cancellation. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if many of you are hearing of this game for the first time now. So for someone to dig up an old build of a game that has been as good as fully forgotten is pretty wild. So of course, I couldn't help myself from giving Lamborghini a try myself. Now unfortunately, I don't own an original Xbox console, so I have to make do with emulation, which can lead to unexpected issues, especially in cases like this, where I'm trying to play a game that didn't really exist up until now. Overall, I quite enjoyed Lamborghini. It felt like a pretty interesting mix of the later Juiced games and the Project Gotham Racing series. The love for the car brand is pretty evident in this one, featuring some niche models I wasn't familiar with yet, and a noticeable care to detail with detailed car specs and animated pop-up headlights. Gameplay-wise, it's a pretty standard tournament racer, quite reminiscent of the older Need for Speed titles, but with some added bells and whistles. For one, you're able to qualify for races, which might lead you to believe this was going to be more of a sim-oriented title, But in reality, cars have huge amounts of grip and driving feels pretty easy. As I said, this game reminded me a lot of the Project Gotham Racing series, and the driving is definitely the main contributor to it. Between races, you get the opportunity to place bets against other racers, though unlike in Juiced, your rivals here are definitely less memorable. Boy, I always wanted to participate in gambling with old people. Furthermore, there seems to be a long-lasting damage model, with you being able to repair your car in the garage. You can also go check out a used car dealer, offering several models of the same type with different prices and mileages. It's obviously hard to say how well the game would have been received based on an unfinished build, even if it is surprisingly playable with the career mode seemingly fully implemented. Though I think we lost a cult classic here. It would have been undoubtedly one of those titles that was going to be stuck on the original Xbox forever, but it might have been a great addition to the console's already fantastic racing game library. But thankfully, not all work was lost. Most of the team who worked on Lamborghini later ended up founding a new dev studio named Juice Games, who were primarily known for the game Juiced and its sequel. As it turns out, Juiced visibly uses a lot of assets and code from Lamborghini. It's almost like a weird street racing spin-off in hindsight. But sadly, even their new dev studio would eventually need to shut their doors, though this time it's because of their publisher THQ filing for bankruptcy. Overall, Lamborghini and its developers are a pretty unfortunate tale of the true risks in video game development. Financials and management will always decide whether a studio is allowed to keep making games or not. And unfortunately for Rage Games and later Juice Games, they didn't get so lucky. But sometimes, the reasons for a cancellation can be a bit more personal, like with this next game. We're still in the early 2000s, and a small studio in Japan has started to make waves overseas. Through the Tokyo Extreme Racer series, developer studio Genki has become quite beloved amongst a niche crowd of JDM enthusiasts. A crowd that would soon become way bigger through the Fast and Furious movies, which popularized street racing culture all around the world. And through the success of the first movie, Genki would get the opportunity of a lifetime to use their racing game knowledge and prowess to develop a tie-in game for the movie. Though it would be mostly uncharted waters for Genki, as they never set any of their racing games outside of Japan. But reluctantly, they accepted the deal and began working on an open-world, customization-focused street racing game based on the then new Fast and Furious brand. The game was first shown off at E3 in 2003, with a handful of gameplay trailers, which made the game look pretty intriguing. Keep in mind, the only street racing game with an open world at the time was Midnight Club, and that one exclusively used unlicensed car models. So Genki had the chance to bring out the world's first open world street racer with licensed cars and customization. They would be a full year ahead of Need for Speed Underground 2, which would end up having a huge effect on the racing game genre. And while gameplay trailers are hard to judge, especially given the quality we have access to nowadays, I think this could have genuinely been a decent Fast and Furious tie-in game. Other Fast and Furious games that would come out in the following years would generally be disliked due to their lacking quality, but something about this one does seem more appealing than the rest. A proper open world based on LA, decent car handling and physics as far as I can tell, and a varied car list with decent customization. If this was going to be even remotely as good as the Tokyo Extreme Racer games were at the time, we would have been in for a treat. But like so often, things change in development. And as such, the game was never shown again past the initial reveal at E3 2003, only to be officially and quietly cancelled 3 years later. The last appearance of the game was through a bonus feature DVD of the second Fast and Furious movie, in which you could find a brief trailer of the game showing off additional bits of gameplay. But other than that, this was it. And unlike with Lamborghini, a playable beta build never made it onto the internet either. As such, only very limited information on the game is available, but from what could be gathered at E3, you were to be taking part in 80 mission-based events in order to become the best street racer of them all. Admittedly, it's a pretty simple premise, but it's not like Genki's other games were any different, so this would have been pretty on brand. Other than that, you drive many major car brands, some of which you could spot in the gameplay footage, like Ford and Toyota. But others such as Mitsubishi, Mazda, Dodge and even Lexus were supposed to make an appearance as well. all featuring rather extensive customization for its time. Since it's a Fast and Furious tie-in game, you'd obviously be able to get behind the wheel of many iconic cars from the movies, like Brian's R34 Skyline and Dom's Charger among many others, presumably winning them through special events or test driving them in some of the special missions scattered throughout the game. Beyond the missions, you would also be able to do regular races, the standout here being drag races, which would allow you to pull off full-on wheelies with your car. As already mentioned, the standout feature would be the open world, which you'd be able to free roam into your heart's content, even featuring police chases if you get the attention of the cops. In fact, it was planned that the game would include 2 maps, each based on Los Angeles and Miami respectively. How big and diverse these maps would have been is unknown obviously, but I think the idea of having 2 vastly different iconic American cities in one game sounds great. Progression in the game would have been handled through a reputation system, which you can see briefly pop up in some of the gameplay videos. How exactly this system would work is unknown, but I assume you'd have to win enough regular races and escape pursuits to increase your rank, which would unlock new story missions, as well as new cars and customization items and upgrades. This covers pretty much all that's publicly known about Genki's cancelled Fast and Furious tie-in game, and I have to say that I'm pretty upset about this one getting canned. As I stated earlier, I think this could have genuinely been the one good Fast and Furious game. The handling looks solid on the videos, I like the reputation idea, and having both LA and Miami as 2 open world maps sounds amazing. I think this was a genuine loss for what could have been a decent competitor to all the other street racing games out at the time, and in many ways it would have been slightly ahead of the curve. But that begs the question, why did we never get to play this game? Time really was of the essence with releasing it on time, and from the looks of it, the game seemed in a decent state. Earlier I mentioned that the reasons for cancelling a game can be a bit more personal and less rooted in management woes. With Genki's Fast and Furious game, it seems that the team had fundamental cultural issues with bringing the game to life. As Genki is a Japanese team who don't have as much experience with American culture and locations, they felt they weren't doing the game justice. What you might not know is that oftentimes, when a game is in its early development stages, a handful of key developers would usually try to visit the place they are trying to base their game around. This is to gain some inspiration for how to build and structure the map, but also to gather assets and photos they might want to use later. With Genki needing to finish the game in a timely manner for a variety of reasons, I assume they didn't get the chance to leave their offices in order to scout out LA and Miami. And since it's 2003, the internet only offers a limited amount of actually usable information on these places. And even then, it would never beat visiting these places in person. So I fully understand why it was so hard for Genki to base a game around the United States, when they have always been more focused on Japanese locations up to this point. And it seems like their publisher at the time agreed. Perhaps the game really wasn't shaping up to be a good Fast and Furious adaptation after all. Despite that, it's still a shame that we're now left with nothing more but mediocre to straight up terrible tie-in games for the series. But what if the opposite is true? What if you have a talented and passionate team working on a game with a strong vision and one of the largest publishers backing you up? What could possibly go wrong? The answer is Rockstar Games. Due to the incredible success of the Mario Kart franchise, it's only natural that many games would try to imitate it. But between all the low-quality shovelware, there was one game that tried to carve its own unique identity into the fun racer genre. Released in 2010, Blur by Bizarre Creations, who were previously known for their Project Gotham Racing series on the Xbox, was a complete subversion of what people used to expect from a fun racer. Karts were swapped out for real-life cars, imaginative and colorful tracks were absent in favor of more grounded, dark environments, and instead of easy drift-based controls, each car actually behaved very realistic with believable handling and physics. While not strictly a sim, Blur was a weird blend of power-up based car combat and an authentic driving experience. Historically, these interesting blends of 2 different kinds of games usually tend to do well. Case in point is the most successful racing game after Mario Kart and Gran Turismo. Need for Speed Most Wanted blended its root identity as a fast-paced street racing game with its at the time new aspects of car customization and lower-end vehicles wrapped up in a grungy atmosphere. For its time, it was the culmination of everything that Need for Speed was, presented with a tone that encapsulated the current zeitgeist perfectly. So on paper, Blur should have been a success. Sure, no one might have been asking for a kart racer with realistic cars and physics, but likewise, no one was asking Need for Speed to change its identity with Underground, yet it still succeeded. And besides, under the hood, Blur did provide something many Mario Kart players were asking for: skill-based gameplay. A fairly common complaint is that Mario Kart games tend to favor those who play poorly. Power-ups are generally distributed randomly, but you can obtain better items the further back you are in the race. This can be frustrating, especially to skilled players, who seemingly get punished for playing well with items like the blue shell. While there is an argument to be made for this contributing to a more even playing field, it's undeniable that there was a player base which was clamoring for more fair and skill-based races. In comes Blur, where power-ups are no longer randomly chosen, but consistently set on parts of the track for you to pick up. It's up to you to learn where you can find which power-ups, and which ones the situation requires the most at any given moment. And as it turned out, Blur began to develop a very dedicated core player base of competitive people who kept playing the game for many years to come. It may never reach the same prestige as a Mario Kart, but its dedication to fair skill-based racing earned it a cult following. One that was seemingly large enough for development on an official sequel to begin. Though sadly, not large enough to actually finish. At the time, Bizarre Creations belonged to publisher Activision, who was disappointed in the low sales numbers the first Blur was making. After only a couple of months in development, all work on a sequel was halted, with the team behind it shortly let go as well. But how could this happen? It seemed like Blur was set up to succeed, as it was catering to a very dedicated audience. One can only speculate, but one aspect that's pretty clear is that the timing of the release of the first game was more than unfortunate. Blur released on the 25th of May in North America. This puts it just behind two other racing game releases at the time, those belonging to Split Second, which released on the 18th that same month, and Mod Nation Races, which was also a power-up combat racer that released on the same day. Unlike those of other genres, the player base of racing games is comparably small. Cars and racing are a more niche hobby in the gaming space compared to large RPGs and shooters. So when your potential player base is getting split between 3 different games, you'll end up losing a lot of those players to those other games. Not everyone was able to or even interested in buying all of them, but if Blur was a standalone release, then it might have been picked up more often by anyone who was curious. Though none of it would have mattered anyway, because there is one giant elephant in the room I have not mentioned yet. In fact, both Split Second and Mod Nation Races were considered commercial failures as well, and it's down to one giant game that overshadowed them all. Predating all of these games, Red Dead Redemption released on May 18th as the most anticipated game of that month, and arguably the entire year. It was the first big-budget open-world game Rockstar has made since GTA 4, one that was heavily marketed everywhere. Every gamer of the early 2010s at least knew about Red Dead Redemption, and the anticipation for it was immeasurable. It carried the kind of hype only a Rockstar game would have, and naturally it overshadowed every single game that dared to release within that same time frame. It's ultimately the reason why Blur didn't meet sales expectations. All eyes were on Rockstar's newest game at the time, with very few people deliberately deciding to ignore its release in favor of alternatives. In general, Rockstar Games releases have been more of a cultural phenomenon. They tend to draw way more attention even from non-gaming media, with people lining up at stores to grab a copy of the latest game. They aren't just game releases, they are full-on events people take time off work for and get together to celebrate. It's also worth noting that Blur's marketing at the time didn't do itself any favors, solely selling itself as a Mario Kart with real cars, which highly undersells its actual premise. But this is what the general gaming audience saw the game as. And why would anyone care about the latest Mario Kart clone with boring real cars, when I can roleplay as a cowboy outlaw in Rockstar's latest magnum opus? By every metric, Blur's release timing was poorly chosen. Even more so in hindsight, knowing that large parts of the game, such as a fully animated story mode, have been cut in order to push the game out sooner, which is exactly the reason why it flopped. And so unfortunately, an official sequel to Blur might never come to fruition with the developer studio having been dissolved. But in 2019, it seemed like we would have a chance to catch a glimpse at what bizarre creations might have been working on at the time. After an Xbox 360 development kit was auctioned off, the buyer discovered a prototype of a Blur sequel on it, which was then leaked online later in early 2020. This prototype, despite clearly in a rough alpha state, was in fact mostly playable and offers some insight on what this sequel could have been. In short, Blur 2 was supposed to be an evolution in almost every way. Along with a new graphics and physics engine, it was supposed to feature massively over-the-top tracks. One of my own personal gripes with the first Blur were the fairly flat and uninteresting track designs, which could have received a huge upgrade with vaster landscapes, more elevation changes, and even the ability to drive through buildings and on walls. The latter is particularly interesting in hindsight, with Mario Kart World introducing that exact mechanic, and it looks like Brizar was way ahead of the curve with wanting to implement driving on walls over a decade before it would eventually be done in Mario Kart. Equally interesting is the car list, which would be expanded to not only feature new brands such as Ferrari and Hyundai, but even motorbikes in the form of various Yamaha models. Said cars would also receive the ability to be customized with various body kits and rims, with you even being able to customize the interior via swapping out dashboards, steering wheels, and even gas pedals, all of which you'd be able to appreciate in a new first-person view. Along with visual customization, you would also be able to upgrade the performance of your cars with the inclusion of real-world tuning brands, which would extend to full engine swaps and fine-tuning very akin to Need for Speed Underground 2. Besides racing on closed tracks, a separate open world mode with cops would also make an appearance, including a full day and night cycle to boast. Really, the more you look into it, it seemed like this was going to be the ultimate racing game. If you want to believe what the internet says. Yeah, for most of the things I mentioned, there are no actual sources other than the people who got their hands on the prototype saying so. I think it's plausible that many traces of these features could be found buried somewhere as unused code and nodes, but in reality I think most of these things would have been scrapped early in development. Some light customization would probably have been included, and even the motorbikes I can totally see being a part of the game, given that Bizarre's previous racing games famously had both cars and bikes on the same track. But stuff like the interior customization and the open world cop mode seem a little out of place for what, at its root, is still a kart racer. Though regardless, watching gameplay of Blur 2's prototype makes me genuinely upset we never got to see the full game come to fruition. It really seemed like it was going to be a step up in almost every way over the original game, and could have garnered way more interest from casual gamers due to its over-the-top nature. Ultimately, any game getting cancelled is a loss, but with Blur 2 I feel particularly bad about it, as it could have really revolutionized the way these kinds of racing games are seen by the public. Blur 1 laid a fantastic foundation and showed that a kart racer can be so much more than a kids game. It can be something competitive adults can enjoy too, and I think we lost something truly great with Blur 2 that could have moved the entire genre forwards. Rest in peace, Bizarre Creations. We believed in you when Activision didn't. Not even the Need for Speed series is safe from cancellations. Or rather, it might not be surprising that there were any, considering the sheer amount of games in the series. Though this entry is a bit of a half cancellation. Let me explain. 7 years after Most Wanted's worldwide success, developer Criterion, who was at the helm of the series back then, wanted to make a direct follow-up to said game. After all, they have already brought out a spiritual successor to Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2, which was a return to the original form the series once had when it began. But with its next entry, Criterion wanted to pay homage to the series' grungy street racing roots and officially began work on Need for Speed Most Wanted 2. But fast forward to release, this is hardly the game we actually got in our hands. While the game was still titled Most Wanted, it had little to nothing in common with its original counterpart, and was more of a successor to Burnout Paradise if anything. Naturally, this led to a massive community backlash at the time, though the game was still considered successful due to decent ratings and sales. So did Criterion just miss the mark? Did they simply not respect the Most Wanted's original vision and just banked off the game's name for some easy sales? While it might have seemed so at the time, it couldn't be further from the truth. Over time, various old builds of the game leaked to the public, showcasing a drastically different game than the one we got. Notably, it maintained its grungy, dark aesthetics of the original game with a greater focus on storytelling and involved police pursuits. There is a whole slew of information about the game's development available these days. And maybe for another video I can talk about cut content from various racing games, as it would probably fit better there. Let me know if that's something you'd like to see. But what I'd definitely like to highlight now is how much the game changed over its last few months of development. While it originally came out in October 2012, builds dating back to as late as February 2012 show the game in a vastly different state. In builds dated around April, we could start to see a drastic change to the game's visuals, with a cleaner UI and different visual treatment, making for a much brighter and colorful look. Around May is when we can begin to see the game take the shape we're now familiar with today, albeit still in a rough and early state. Based on that, we can deduce that the original vision of the game was scrapped sometime in March, if not a little earlier than that. The exact reason for this change is still unknown to this day, though it is fair to assume corporate meddling might have been the case. It's not exactly a secret that publisher EA is notorious for sabotaging its own games, and it wouldn't sound far off for a representative to demand changes in the game's direction. After all, they are the ones funding the development of the game. Criterion is merely working on it. So if higher-ups at EA decide they want the game to be different, Criterion needs to follow suit. This honestly sounds like the only plausible reason for a change in direction, as Criterion seemed pretty confident in the game's original vision. Hundreds of art assets have already been made at this point, along with bits and pieces of voice dialogue belonging to a storyline. The game's foundations were already there, and to throw all of that away would be a massive waste of development time and costs, especially with the release date only around half a year away. It would have been exceedingly hard to convince EA this would be worth it, unless they are the ones who called for it. In fact, it's nothing short of a miracle that the game was still released on time without any delays in a functional state. Development on Most Wanted 2 was essentially soft rebooted midway through, and within only a handful of months they managed to completely turn the game around without any noticeable issues in the final product. If anything, it's remarkable things still managed to turn out fine for the game. To this day, I have never heard of such a drastic reboot in the middle of game development. It's like you're looking at a completely different game, looking at these beta builds. While these development reboots do happen, it's usually early on while the project is still in its pre-alpha stages. That way, changes can be applied smoothly, without major time being wasted on content that will inevitably be thrown out in the end. But with Most Wanted, we've seen an extremely late change in the game's entire identity. While it's normal for content to be cut from games late in development, it tends to limit itself to small things like minor dialogue lines or reduced objects on the map. Most Wanted 2 doing a complete 180 this late into development was anything but normal, to the point where I decided to still mention it in this video. Because yes, technically this is a case of cut content and not an outright cancellation, but in this instance it would be fair to say that the original Most Wanted 2 was an entirely different game in almost every aspect. The addition of a storyline, pursuit tech from Hot Pursuit, the different atmosphere, and even cut cars all point towards a game that was meant to be something else entirely. So in a way, by EA presumably demanding a change of direction, the original game has been somewhat cancelled. Especially since the last few beta builds before the change seem to be surprisingly playable, aside from unfinished parts of the map and stability issues. It's almost frustrating knowing now that Most Wanted 2012 was a commercial success, as that only seemed to validify EA in their decision. But I truly believe that, had the original vision of the game been maintained, it could have been an even bigger success that EA ultimately missed out on. To this day, an official sequel to the original Most Wanted or even just a simple remaster, are among the most requested things of the wider racing game community. And to know we were this close to actually getting one really hurts. Most Wanted 2's development will remain as one of the most tragic stories in racing game history, and a testament to how corporate meddling can bastardize a project beyond recognition. And unfortunately, this is not where EA's involvement ends. The mobile gaming space has dramatically shifted over the years towards a more free-to-play, microtransaction-based market. This wasn't always the case, however, as back then mobile gaming was just an extension of handheld gaming. The App Store would primarily feature pay-to-play games, and one of these was Real Racing. Released in 2009, it blew everyone's expectations of what modern smartphones could actually be capable of out of the water. This was a time where people were slowly transitioning away from cell phones, which could only play various Java-based games. So to go from these to a full-blown HD racing game with a fully animated interior view and real-time lighting was nothing short of revolutionary. Real Racing has received near-perfect reviews upon its release, most of which was certainly due to its technical novelty, though under the hood was still a very solid game with fun controls. 2013 would mark a shift in the series, as Real Racing 3 would inevitably pivot to a freemium model that was becoming increasingly more common with mobile games. Ironically, this would backfire pretty hard, as the reception for the game would now be a lot more mixed. While at its core it was a noticeable evolution for the series, especially graphically, the freemium model was now rubbing both critics and players the wrong way. While the game was free to play, the included in-app purchases bordered on daylight robbery, with large parts of the game's content being locked behind a paywall, particularly faster cars that would be needed to be competitive in online multiplayer races. Even more egregious was the need to maintain your own cars, which would cause dramatic performance loss if cars were used too often without spending your already limited in-game currency on maintaining them, which could also take several hours of real-world time. Of course, this was just another ploy to entice players to spend money on their game, and illustrates the levels of frustration players met by the game's new freemium model. Despite everything, Real Racing 3 was still considered one of the more populated mobile racing games at its time, and surely found a core player base that was willing to pay regularly for new content updates and progression, as is the case with many popular mobile titles. So it's no surprise that EA eventually commissioned work on another sequel, only to cancel it shortly after the fact. Real Racing 4 was reportedly cancelled very early in development in 2019, and as such not much is known about the game itself. It's fair to assume it would have been yet another free-to-play title, with a heavy focus on featuring contemporary cars and a more realistic handling model. Interestingly enough, it stated that EA's decision to cancel Real Racing 4 was entirely monetary driven, which would certainly fall in line with the EA I grew to know. But I can't say the reasoning makes much sense. After all, Real Racing 3 still had a very dedicated player base well into the late 2010s, and was one of the most recognizable IPs as far as mobile racing games go. Cancelling the game this early on also reveals a severe lack of confidence in the project. But how much money does a free-to-play mobile game need to make for them to fund another one? Surely Real Racing 4 would have been an easy success and made its money back tenfold. After all, their other mobile racing game, Need for Speed No Limits, was decently successful. Same as other ones like Asphalt 9. And these two are both competing with each other in the arcade racer genre. Real Racing 4 would have safely occupied the more simulation-oriented market, with not a whole lot of competition in sight. To me, it seemed like quick and easy money for EA, so I got no clue why you'd call for a cancellation on this one. And in hindsight, I don't think much of value has been lost, as I can imagine the game's most innovative features would have been in the microtransaction department. Yet even then, cancelling the game is still a net loss for everyone, as even the most egregious mobile games eventually get picked up by the community and get turned into something far more enjoyable. Perhaps Real Racing 4 could have enjoyed the same treatment in due time, turning into a fun simcade racer on the go. But unfortunately, we will never find out, as the game faded into obscurity, much like this next franchise, which could have had the revival of a lifetime. There are very few racing games which enjoy the amount of pedigree as Ridge Racer. Born as one of the very first 3D home console racing games, Ridge Racer is one of the longest running franchises in the genre. It brought fast, arcade-style racing into the living rooms of many people in the early 90s, and as such became a recognizable name even amongst those who typically don't interact with racing games. Over time, the franchise managed to make appearances across almost every console, from the Nintendo 64 over the PlayStation and even the Xbox, which certainly helped with its wide recognizability. But all of that changed after the release of Ridge Racer 7, the last truly pure entry in the series. Past this point in the 2010s, entries on both the Nintendo 3DS and PlayStation Vita were widely considered unsatisfactory. The Vita version in particular was slammed for its poor DLC practices, releasing only a smidgen of content on the disc. The unhappy sentiment around the series eventually culminated into Ridge Racer Unbounded, which marked a stark departure for the series which most fans did not get on board with, leading to disappointing sales figures for the entry. Unbounded would then mark the last major title in this series, as the series went down with a whimper via a few mediocre attempts to cash in on the mobile game market. And that's where the series stays today, and it's been nearly 20 years without an authentic follow-up to Ridge Racer 7. Though sadly, we were close to finally getting an answer as an unfinished build of Ridge Racer 8 emerged in early 2025. Dating back to 2017, Ridge Racer 8 was presumably meant to be a launch title for the then brand new Nintendo Switch, and a return to form for the series. Gone would be the destruction mechanics of Unbounded, traded in for a more traditional gameplay loop on imaginative, futuristic tracks. Oftentimes, less is more, and in the case of Ridge Racer, that certainly rings true. In fact, much of the menus and UI already looks completed, though the same cannot be said about the gameplay itself. It's always unfair to judge an unfinished product, but with the prototype build of Ridge Racer 8, it's fair to say that more work was necessary. Physics and handling seem widely unpolished, and many placeholder assets are still in place. The prototype borrows a lot from its predecessor on the Vita, and I'm sure most of the content from that game would have found its way onto the Switch through this game. It's hard to say whether Ridge Racer 8 would have found success, but on paper it seems like it would have been a much needed return to form. Assuming they wouldn't have done a repeat of the Vita version with its DLC controversies, Ridge Racer 8 might have been one of the most beloved games on the Nintendo Switch, as that console is noticeably lacking racing game alternatives for Mario Kart. And a new Ridge Racer returning to its roots exclusively for the Switch may have been exactly what not just the console needed, but the series as a whole needed as well. But alas, a new Ridge Racer game has not seen the light of day throughout the Switch's entire lifespan, and it's unknown what happened to the development of said game. Some say the game is still alive somewhere to this day, as development has restarted in order to bring it onto the PlayStation 5 on launch, only to then end up in limbo again. No matter the case, it's unlikely we will see this iteration of Ridge Racer again in the future past the prototype which has been leaked to the internet. But one drop of hope remains, as the original Ridge Racer will be making a return as part of the arcade archives. The first release of the series we have seen since its last mobile game in 2016, even if it is a re-release. So who knows, maybe this is to prepare people for a new game announcement to come sometime in the future. But as far as the cancelled prototype of Ridge Racer 8 is concerned, that will remain shrouded in mystery for what it could have been. As you can see, cancellations of video games are pretty inevitable. Making games is a grueling task that takes countless of hours of manpower and money, and sometimes things just don't work out. In fact, everything we talked about today were known cases of cancelled games. Who knows how many titles are out there we will never know about. So what's the moral behind this story? If there is any. I think it's always a shame when a game never leaves the office. After all, countless people still spend hours on these, and we would never get to enjoy their work. I imagine many game developers do their work for the money, but I think there's also a not insignificant portion of those who make games because they want to immortalize themselves in them. They want to build things that people can enjoy for years to come. After all, this is why games have credits in them, to respect the work each of those people put into the game. And so when a game gets cancelled, all of their work is essentially erased from existence. And the worst part is that in the few cases where we still get to see their work regardless, thanks to leaked betas and prototypes, many of us still enjoy what little there is of the game. No matter how broken or unfinished it is, every game still has its value to someone out there. And I think this extends to pretty much everything, not just games. In fact, I almost cancelled this very video because I didn't think it was funny enough. But I still ended up going through with it. And seeing how you're still here, hopefully enjoying this video, it means that I do have a point somewhere. No matter how much I might believe that this video didn't live up to its potential, I assume there's probably a bunch of you out there who still found some value in it. And so if this can be applied to YouTube videos and games at the same time, I think this can be applied to pretty much anything. Anything that you worked on has value, no matter what it is, how unfinished it is, or how unhappy you are with it. It's almost never worth it to just drop a project and delete all of its contents forever, because there might always be someone out there who would find it really interesting and cool. I mean, I've definitely worked on videos that never saw the light of day because I wasn't happy with them. And I think from now on, I'm gonna stop doing that and just put them out there for you guys to see. And maybe, if you think I have a point, consider applying the same mentality to whatever it is that you've been working on. Because after all, you never know who you might make happy with it. Thank you for watching.